the first part, we saw how the thirst for salt was embedded deep in our cells. But when that thirst left the personal level and took on a social and collective form, the history of modern human civilization was born. About 10,000 years ago, a radical change occurred in the way people lived, which we call the Neolithic Revolution. People left their nomadic life and began to settle down. And in parallel with this story of settling down, as hunter-gatherers, our ancestors didn't have to worry about salt. They got their sodium from the warm blood and raw meat of wild animals. But when humans took up the plow and began to cultivate wheat, barley, or rice, a strange and painful problem arose. An agricultural society meant a predominantly plant-based diet, and plant cells contain much more potassium than sodium. Muscle tension, severe headaches, and a strange lethargy befell the agricultural people. They couldn't understand why their bodies were breaking down. But a strange instinct in nature showed them the way.
They noticed that cattle would go to a certain stone and lick it madly. Humans broke the stone and put it in their mouths to taste the familiar salty taste. The magical taste of salt not only satisfied their taste buds, but also reactivated their nerves. This is where the second chapter of salt began. Salt was no longer just a part of evolution, but salt then became the fuel of civilization.
What was the biggest contribution of salt to the development of civilization? If you think that it only enhanced the taste of food, you would be wrong. The real power of salt was the power to stop time. The biggest enemy in ancient times was decay. Fish were caught on the seashore, but it was not possible to send that fish to the desert or mountains miles away. The meat of the huge deer that was hunted would spoil within a few days. But one day, people discovered a groundbreaking technique. They saw that if any food was immersed in a lot of salt, it would remain edible even after a month. The salt molecules actually absorb water from the food cells, osmosis, so bacteria cannot reproduce there.
Salt is not available everywhere. There is salt on the seashore, but what will the people in the interior of the continent do? This disparity gave rise to the world's first trade route. You may have heard of the Silk Road, but silk was a luxury item, and salt was a necessity. So the Salt Road was built long before the Silk Road. The city of Rome in Europe was built around this salt road, or Via Salaria. The salt was carried on backs from the salt mines on the banks of the Tiber River to the interior of Italy. Think of the Sahara Desert in Africa. There, salt was worth as much as gold. Tuareg nomads would travel hundreds of miles from Tudeni to Timbuktu with huge caravans of camels just to carry sacks of salt. At that time, 1 kilogram of salt was worth 1 kilogram of gold. Why? Because gold is used to make ornaments, but people cannot live without salt.
This discovery was as revolutionary as the discovery of fire. Salt became the world's first time machine. It gave people the ability to store food for the future. In the bone-chilling cold of winter, when there was no crop outside, no game, then fish and meat soaked in salt water or covered in dry salt became the only hope for people. The fact that we eat salted hilsa fish or dried fish today is a memory of the struggle for survival thousands of years ago. When salt was learned to preserve, it became possible to form large armies. When soldiers went on expeditions to distant lands, they would carry sacks of food preserved in salt on their backs. Without salt, it would never have been possible for Alexander or Genghis Khan to expand their empires.
From this salt trade, big cities were born. Just by hearing the name of the city of Salzburg in Austria, its history can be understood. Salz means salt, and Berg means castle. That is, a salt castle. Every stone, every church in the city was built with the money from the salt trade. Not only in Europe, but in Chinese civilization, emperors used to fill their coffers by imposing a monopoly on salt. The construction cost of the world's first Great Wall, or the Great Wall of China, came mostly from salt taxes.
Those of us who work,
waiting for our salary or salad at the end of the month, do we know that the salty history of salt is hidden within this word? When Roman soldiers fought on the battlefield, they were often given a special allocation of salt, or a bag of salt, as part of their salary. This was called salarium. Salt comes from the Latin word sal, and from the soldier's salarium, the modern English word salary, or salad. At that time, to judge how skilled a person was in his work, it was said, is he worth his salt? That is he worthy of his salt? If someone was lazy, he would not be given salt as a salary. Even today, the importance of salt in the world remains in our language. The gratitude of
Drying seawater and making salt was time-consuming and dependent on the weather, so people started looking for a more permanent source of salt. They discovered rock salt. The Kavra mine in Pakistan, at the foot of the Himalayas, or the Wieliczka mine in Poland were the wonders of that ancient time. People went down hundreds of feet below the ground and started cutting mountains of salt. Those dark mines are filled with the sweat and blood of thousands of workers. The history of salt remains incomplete without mentioning the Wieliczka mine in Poland. There, miners built a huge cathedral or church underground by piling up salt rocks. From lanterns to floor tiles, everything was made of salt. This proves that salt was not just a resource for people, it was a divine gift.
the hunger for salt forced people to go beyond the horizon. Many settlements in America and India were built around natural salt springs or salt lakes. The indigenous people of North America followed the footsteps of wild buffalo to reach places where there were underground saltwater streams. Those paths were later transformed into modern highways. Salt was the first object that helped people understand the world map. It was the world's first global commodity. Because of salt, social divisions between people became clear. Those who had control of the salt mines or the sea became the masters, and those who depended on them for salt became the subjects. This power game would eventually give rise to major wars over salt. In today's second part, we saw how salt turned a hunter into a farmer, how a civilization of light emerged from the dark mines, and how modern urbanization began along the path of salt. We learned why our salary is named after salt. But was salt just a blessing? No. Behind this white, sparkling crystal of salt, there are also bloodstains hidden. Exploitation began, centered on salt. The kings realized that just as people cannot stop breathing, they cannot stop eating salt either. So if a huge tax can be imposed on salt, people will be forced to pay it even if they don't want to. This history of tax and exploitation will give rise to the third chapter of the story of salt. How can a pinch of salt destroy great empires? Starting from the Roman Empire to the British rule in India, how will salt become a weapon of freedom? We will know that exciting history in the third part of the epic poem of salt. Civilization had by then reached its full maturity, but the thirst for salt had turned into a lust for power. A pinch of white gold would now show its cruel side. In the first two parts, we saw how salt dominated every cell in our bodies and how it settled nomadic people and paved the way for civilization. But as the wheel of history rolled further, the salty taste of salt was no longer limited to food. Salt became a symbol of power, a cause of war, and the main financial element in building empires. In this third part, we will enter the dark and royal chapter of salt's history, where it was called white gold. We get our first lesson in the political power of salt from ancient China. Almost 2,000 years ago, the emperors of China's Han Dynasty realized a strange truth. They saw that people could live without luxuries, but not without salt. Emperor Wu realized that if the state had complete control over the production and sale of salt, it would be possible to fill the treasury without taking any direct taxes from the subjects. Thus was born the state monopoly on salt. With that salt money,
China operated its huge army and built the Great Wall of China to prevent attacks from the north. When you look at the Great Wall, you actually see a huge architecture made of salt. Behind every brick of the wall is a salt tax. This policy of China later became a model for other empires around the world. To control the subjects, seize their salt jar.
The city of Venice was a wonder in medieval Europe. How did this floating city become the master of trade in the Middle East and Europe? The answer is salt. The Venetians knew that seawater was abundant around them, and by drying up this water, they developed a huge salt industry. The rulers of Venice attached so much importance to the salt trade that they would prevent other small cities from producing salt. If necessary, they would go to war to destroy their salt mines. They would buy oriental spices, silk, and precious stones in exchange for salt. Those huge palaces and extraordinary architecture of Venice all were actually built with the money from salt profits. Venice taught us that whoever owns the salt warehouses owns the geopolitical power. At that time, salt was called white gold because its weight and importance were literally equivalent to gold.
Salt had a peculiar use in medieval royal feasts. Salt was so expensive that it was not kept in ordinary earthenware. Instead, expensive salt cellars or salt pots made of gold or silver were kept in the royal court. Nobility was determined based on where the salt pot was placed on the banquet table. Kings or high-ranking guests sat in front of the salt pot. This was called above the salt. And ordinary soldiers or low-ranking officials sat far away from the salt pot, which was called below the salt. Today, when we say to someone in English, he is not worth his salt, or talk about someone's social status, we are actually reminding ourselves of the salty inequality of that royal table. Salt then became a bigger measure of a person's social superiority than the hunger of a person's stomach.
Just as empires were built because of salt, so too were great kingdoms destroyed because of salt. The greatest example of this is the French gabelle, or salt tax. The French kings imposed such a cruel tax on salt that it became a burden on the lives of the common people. It was stipulated by law that every French citizen, even a child, had to buy a certain amount of salt from the royal store at a high price every week. Anyone who privately manufactured or smuggled salt was punished with death or slave labor on a galley. This salt tax was not only economic exploitation, it was a great humiliation. This salt tax was one of the main sources of resentment in the minds of French farmers and day laborers. Historians believe that this extreme injustice towards salt by the kings was as much a factor in the famous French Revolution of 1789 as the lack of bread. When the revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, the bitter taste of salt was still fresh in their minds.
Salt was often more important than swords and cannons on the battlefield, because, as mentioned earlier, the lack of salt meant that the army's supplies would rot. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia, one of the reasons for the defeat of his huge army was the lack of salt. The wounds of Napoleon's soldiers were not healing in the cold, and their horses were dying due to the lack of salt. Without horses, it was not possible to pull supplies. Due to the lack of salt in the salty ice of Russia, Napoleon's great glory turned to dust. The same scene was seen in the American Civil War. When the Confederate or Southern soldiers lost control of the salt mines, they were unable to preserve their meat. The soldiers became hungry and weak. The salty lack of salt turned the tide of the war. General William Sherman knew that it was not possible to win the war without salt, so he targeted the salt factories first. Salt was an invisible soldier, without which no general could feel safe.
As Europeans began to colonize the world, salt became a major tool of exploitation. Wherever they went, they seized natural sources of salt. As a result, the local people, who had been making their own salt for thousands of years, became slaves. Working in salt mines was one of the most painful jobs in the world.
The heat and the saltiness would cause the workers' skin to burst and bleed. But to the imperialists, that blood had no value. To them, every grain of salt was a symbol of profit. The slave trade began around salt. Slaves were brought from Africa to work in the salt mines.
The sparkling salt we see on our dining tables today can be traced back to the cries of thousands of slaves. Salt was no longer a symbol of life. It became a chain of subjugation. The most influential and tragic chapter in the story of salt was written in our Indian subcontinent. When the British East India Company came to India, they first attacked salt. Despite India's vast coastline, ordinary Indians were forbidden from making salt. The people of this country were forced to buy salt from Liverpool, which came from abroad. The British imposed such a high tax on salt that a poor person had to spend a large part of his entire year's income just to buy a handful of salt.
This oppression of salt was the biggest disgrace of British rule. They probably did not think that this very simple pinch of salt would one day shake the foundations of their vast empire. At the end of the third part, we see that salt is no longer just a mineral or a food ingredient. It is a political weapon. The Great Wall was built with it, the fire of revolution was lit with it, and billions of people were enslaved with it. Salt has taught people that the fight for freedom and rights begins with common needs.
In their arrogance, empires forgot that the ocean that flows in human blood cannot be kept in a cage forever. A pinch of salt will someday roar against the swords of kings and the guns of companies. But how? How will a pinch of salt become the symbol of a nation's freedom? How will a skinny man drown the sun of the British Empire by boiling salt water? We will know the story of that epic struggle in the fourth part, the taste of revolution and the march of the Mahatma.